another meal, another event on the Sabbath. Us like last week, one being healed on the Sabbath. Today we have a Sabbath meal, this time at the leader of the community, at the leader of one of the Pharisees. This is probably one of the top dogs, for a better way of saying it. I mean, we're talking about probably the big guy that's going to see what Jesus is all about. Scriptures say he went there and they watched him closely. I'm sure they did. I'm sure he was really annoying to all of them. This is another example, though, of the kingdom of God and the way that God works in our lives and what is to be visioned at the kingdom of God, visioned to us as a banquet, as a meal. Jan Richardson, the great poet and writer, she always says that there's endless wisdom of the table. Jesus is always bringing us to the endless wisdom of what comes from the table, and that's this kind of wisdom. People are seated in a particular way. Sometimes they like it, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're the guest of honor, sometimes they aren't. Have you ever been someplace where, well, I shouldn't talk about you. Maybe I should just talk about me. I was just at a place, let's just say, across the ocean with 700 or 800 bishops. Archbishop of Canterbury invited us all to his palace, as one does, for a lunch, and we're all sitting under a big tent. I mean, it was like 2,000. It was the Archbishop and 2,000 of his closest friends, right? I mean, there were like 2,000 people, and I was thinking, I mean, there were probably there were hundreds of tables, right? It was this great big long thing, and I thought, this isn't going to be broadcast, is it? Yeah, okay. I was kind of like a little tired of the messages all week, so I was hoping maybe be in the back of the tent. And there were just a couple people I did not want to have dinner with, lunch with. You know what I mean? And I'm thinking, so I'm walking in there and I'm going, what are the odds, right? Because there literally were 2,000 people in this thing. Don't I sit down at the table, and across the table is like the one person. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. It was I was like, oh, and of course it was as bad as I imagined it was going to be. Like, I don't even have a good ending to it. Like, oh, it turned out great, and it was painful, and it was hot, and all this. Sometimes that's the way it is. I don't know if God works that way quite or not, but I think it was a bit of a lesson in that one way or another. I think I learned something about table fellowship with people that we like and that we don't. And at the kingdom table, at the banquet table, everyone's there. Now, sometimes I'm hoping some people are at the way other end, but we're all in. Now, Jesus gives them some wisdom too. It's a shame and honor culture for sure. The most important people were sat next to the host. I mean, if you come up with Emily Post or whatever, the person sits at the right of the host is the most important, and all this kind of thing. So you wouldn't just walk in and sit there. At least you shouldn't, but some people probably do. They're that unaware. And so Jesus is saying, look, when you go in, sit down lower, wait to be invited up. It sounds like a bit of political advice. Like, it sounds like common sense advice, somebody who ought to know better. Like, if you don't know any better, that you don't go in and sit right next to the host, you probably do need to be told that directly. But really what Jesus is saying too, I mean, he is saying that. He's giving them practical advice, but he's also saying something else very important, because he says, go sit at the lowest place, or at the farthest boundary is another way to interpret. Go sit at the furthest boundary of that table. Go sit at the furthest boundary. It's there on the furthest place that you meet the people that you wouldn't normally meet. You meet the people that might make you a little uncomfortable. You may even at the boundary have to sit with the person you really didn't want to sit with. But likely you're to meet people that you wouldn't normally meet, see people you wouldn't normally see, encounter people and a different way of being. In other words, like watch a different news channel, all right? Read a different editorial columnist. Find people whom you've had a hard time with and figure out what that's about. Find the people on the margins and bring them to the center. Go to the farthest place and sit there. Then you will be invited up. It isn't just about later being honored. Go sit there. Now, Luke, in the Lucan gospel, we were constantly reminded that we're perpetual guests. That's part of the theme of the Gospel of Luke. We're going to stick with Luke for the rest of this year. You're going to love, the fall is fabulous. The Lucan parables are coming up this fall. They're amazing. Just wait. I mean, I can't wait to be preaching on those. I can't wait to have you hear and read these Lucan parables. But they're constant reminders that we're constantly guests of God. No matter where we are, we're guests. We're perpetual guests. We're now being invited by Jesus to sit at the farthest boundary, the place where we're most uncomfortable. Go sit there. Because even though we're perpetual guests, Jesus, God, realizes that sometimes we will also be called to be a host. Sometimes we're brokers of things, and sometimes we are the host. And if as guests we have sit at the furthest place, we've gone to the farthest boundary, as hosts, we'll know who to invite. We'll know that it just isn't our brother or sister, our rich neighbor, the person that can reciprocate. We don't do it for the quid pro quo. We know who to invite because we've been out on the edge. We sit at the furthest places and we know who to invite. We know who God will invite to the center. And that's a powerful piece of table wisdom as well. It's only when we sit at the furthest place that we know who to invite, when we have the opportunity to become the host. Invite people who cannot reciprocate. Because ultimately, reciprocation comes by the host, which is God in the end. And that reciprocation is the resurrection of all, the changing of the world, the full justice of God. We are guests at God's table. We enact this every week as we come to the altar. We first begin as the hosts, as we prepare the altar and bring our gifts forward. And then we switch roles. We become the guest and God becomes the host. That's why we receive the host. That's why we call it that. We're receiving the host, because God then becomes the host of all. It's good for us to sit at the furthest place, and not only sit at the furthest place, but to interact with those at the furthest place. We might learn something. I like when I go to big church meetings or other places, I like to go outside with the smokers. Because they're the most interesting people, believe it or not. Not always, or the people that are the closet smokers, they don't want you to know they do, but they're out there puffing away outside. They're like the most interesting people ever. Wherever you go, wherever that furthest boundary is that you find, whatever it is that takes you to a place where you haven't been, know that will allow you to host someone, to bring someone to the center, so that ultimately God becomes the host and all of us sit around the same table.